Hello and welcome. My name is Jeremy Porteous and I'm the Chief Executive of the Housing Learning and Improvement Network, an extensive professional network for those working in housing and ageing. I'm also a Knowledge Transfer Research Fellow and delighted to chair the afternoon flagship symposium Housing Futures on the 2nd of July, day 2 of the British Society of Gerontology's virtual annual conference. While the BSG is renowned for championing world-leading research on ageing with a social policy focus, you may not know that it's been quietly influential in the housing research arena too. From qualitative work at the King's College London in understanding the needs of older homeless people, to understanding the loneliness and isolation experienced by older people in sheltered and extra care housing, a current project led by School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol and chaired by the BSG President, Professor Tom Scharf. As a policymaker at the Department of Health in the 2000s, I remember attending the first ever Housing and Care for Older People research group at the BSG conference at Keele University. 15 years on, it is great to see housing is now a permanent fixture at this prestigious event. In this afternoon symposium, 3 experts will explore and discuss the future of housing for an ageing population. Who better to chart this expedition than 3 highly respected speakers who all have considerable academic and applied research backgrounds. I am delighted to be joined by David Robinson, Professor of Housing and Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield. He'll be kicking off on the housing options of older people, charting a path to a positive housing future. He will be followed by Julia Park, a distinguished author, architect and head of research at Levitt Bernstein. She'll be covering Living Longer, Living Better, the role of good design. And we conclude with Sue Adams, OBE, Chief Executive of Care and Repair England and Chair of the Housing and Ageing Alliance, who will be sharing her insights on The Future is Now, the role of existing homes to sustain a healthy, ageing population. The symposium promises to be a thought-provoking tour of the housing and ageing research landscape. I look forward to everyone who's getting on board to join us on this journey. Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Robinson. I'm based at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield. I'm also a co-investigator at the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak at the BSG conference. I want to talk about housing options of older people and reflect upon why within the English housing system we're failing to provide a diversity of options and possibilities that meet the needs and aspirations of people in older age. First, I would like to suggest is that when it comes to understanding what the problem is and what the prescription or response might be, I think there's a strong evidence base and there's a general consensus. So I don't think it's for want of understanding the issues. I think we know that too many older people are living in poor quality and or inappropriate housing. We understand that that undermines independent living and has impacts on quality of life and health and well-being. And in addition to the impacts on the individuals and households, we know that has knock-on consequences for wider society, including health and social care. We're also aware of the fact that there's an aging population, that there's increasing demand for an array of new and extended services, within this diverse population of older people, which includes housing, but there's a lack of choice and opportunity, both for people who want to stay put, in terms of ensuring they're living in decent quality housing, which is appropriate in terms of adaptations, etc., as well as the options and choices for people who might want to move to more appropriate housing by virtue of its design, layout, size, location. That might be in general needs or in specialist housing sector. So we're failing to accommodate the ongoing adjustments that people need to make with their environment as they age. And I think there's a consensus about what the response should look like. And I've identified here 5 sort of elements or aspects of the prescription or solution for tackling this problem. housing support and assistance services, that's repairs, maintenance, adaptations to ensure people are living in suitable housing. Addressing the accessibility and livability problems we have in our housing stock, which is some of the oldest in Europe, by ensuring that all new housing is built to accessibility standards which promote independent living in older age. Ensuring that we have a specialist housing sector which is responding to needs and playing an important role as part of the housing solutions in older age, and addressing the variability in the geography of that provision and making sure that at the local level supply meets demand. Providing information and advice so that people, individuals, households, families and professionals are aware of the options and choices that people are facing, and so they can make informed choices. And that often is a difficult and complex point in time. And ensuring that we break down the silos and we promote synergies between housing policy, health and social care policy, and that people can get health and social care services regardless of what housing they live in. So that's the kind of general position. I think the problem is that we're failing to deliver against that prescription. I want to reflect a little bit on that. I think the overarching reason why we're failing is that national housing policy in England is as a set of entrenched beliefs, thoughts, words, actions, habits and values, which are myopic to some extent. They don't recognise the role that housing plays within society. They have quite a narrow understanding of that role, which focuses on the economic and doesn't focus on the social or health implications. We have quite simplistic notions of need that reduce need to being a homeowner far too often. And if one goes along with that, one then finds, the argument emerging that, well, older people are in need because they're already homeowners. 80% of older people are homeowners. They're asset rich, and if they can release that equity, the market will respond to the demand that's created and meet their needs. And this fits into wider processes of the transformation of the role of the state in relation to housing, which involves moving away from having involvement in direct provision and increasingly becoming a commodifying agent, which is facilitating the market to respond and meet need. And just to give one figure that exemplifies this is that in 2015-16, the Audit Commission estimates that £28 billion of public money was spent on housing. So it's not that the state isn't investing in housing, it's investing in particular ways, particularly in facilitating the market. And focus on particular issues. So if you look at recent white papers on housing, the focus is very much upon how do we secure access to the so-called housing ladder for younger people. And older people's housing issues are hardly mentioned, if at all, in recent government announcements around housing. So there's a set of habits and values that are ingrained within the way that national policy and often the kind of political and popular discussion reflect upon housing and its role in our society. And I think the challenge for us is to start breaking down those presumptions, questioning those values and beliefs, and promoting a different set of understandings around what housing is and its importance within our society. That's a set of issues which are listed here on the left. Prevailing notions around housing are listed on the right. I think there's a set of tensions, and we need to start working with and challenging these. And I only think we get the political will to address the issue around housing options of older people if we shift the debate toward the left of this list and away from the right more. I'm not suggesting that that housing isn't going to be a market commodity and its economic value is not going to be an important dimension, but I think we need to promote and valorize the importance of housing as home, its use value, that housing is a public good. In short, I think we need to return to an understanding of housing as a common good, rather than merely supporting the market principles and promoting competition and growth. I think there's a challenge here in terms of moving toward this housing future for us as researchers. And I think as researchers interested in housing, both coming from the traditions of gerontology and housing studies and urban studies, maybe our work's been siloed too much or segmented. We've looked at different housing situations. We've explored the views and opinions of people in those situations. We've measured the costs and benefits of those housing situations against health and social care priorities. We've generated formative insights into the effective development and delivery of these different housing solutions. but we haven't asked the more kind of pointed questions like who gets what housing, where and why? And that's a much more political question to ask. We've got to move away from that segmentation and viewing housing options in isolation to recognise that housing options in older age are part of a wider housing system, and there's a complex political economy to that system. So we need to be asking, what's the intersection of market mechanisms and residual housing welfare services that inform the housing options of older people? And in doing so, for us as researchers, I think it demands that we recognise the complex interconnections between housing policy, markets and provision, and wider political and economic processes. And only by doing so can we start exposing the processes that resulting in the problems that I think we all would acknowledge exist in terms of meeting the housing options of older people.
Hello everyone, I'm Julia Park. I'm an architect and head of housing research at Levitt Bernstein. We're a fairly large multidisciplinary practice with offices in London and Manchester, and about 2/3 of our work, I guess, is housing related. We also do quite a lot of arts projects and education facilities, but our roots are really in housing. This is the cover of the first Happy report, which we co-authored in 2009. I have to confess that I hadn't really thought much about housing for older people at all until then. And PTE Architects and we, Levitt Bernstein, were jointly appointed to escort Lord Best, our chairman, and 12 experts in the subject to seek out good examples of housing for older people across Europe and report back. That was in 2009, a fascinating experience that resulted in this report as the first of 5, actually, and I'm sure that there'll be more to come. You're probably familiar with the series. The project was jointly commissioned by what was then the Department for Communities and Local Government and the Department of Health. It was specifically about design, what good looks like and how it can help us live better lives as well as longer lives. There was a feeling that other parts of Northern Europe were doing rather better than us here in the UK. And I guess our visits and our exploratory work found that to be largely true. So we were able to bring home some useful lessons. Almost 10 years after that first Happy report, Jeremy Porteous, our chair for this discussion, and I were commissioned by the RIBA to write a book about the design of what we delicately called age-friendly housing. It was a perfect opportunity to see what had changed here since that first Happy report, and look around Europe again and see whether they had moved on even further. Of course, any book about design has to touch on other things, and indeed our book does. We look at the history of older people's housing, we look at the typical health impacts, what older people themselves are looking for, how they can participate in the process. We look at shared spaces, private spaces, and across the whole range of options which are beginning to open up. Researching for the book, it became pretty clear that design has moved on here in the UK over the last 10 years, and that there are many more options coming available too. This diagram gives an impression of that, but it's easier to give you a glimpse of some of the case studies in the book. And here in this diagram and in the following slides, which I'll show you in a second, the options become more specialised as you move through from left to right in this diagram and through the slides coming up now. Here's a lovely contemporary house, which I think many of us, regardless of age, would love to live in. It was actually designed and built by a chap for his aging parents, and there are, again, I haven't got time to go into details, but many thoughtful features that will help them as they grow older in this home, and a tremendous amount of thought given into sort of simple daily pleasures like watching the sun come up and where the kitchen table is, and excellent daylight and lovely touches which which I think they will appreciate more and more. We are still building bungalows, even in London, in fact. Not many, but in some situations, single-storey dwellings are still appropriate, and these are making lovely homes for older people in Greenwich. This is a co-housing scheme, again in London, North London this time. You may have seen it on the press. It's attracted a huge amount of attention, and far and away the most talked about example in the book. A fascinating story. It's lived in by a group of older women who got together, and it took them 20 years, but they finally achieved this lovely development, which allows them to live in close proximity, but each with their own flat and a couple of rooms which they regularly share and enjoy together. This is a multi-generational, multicultural building, divided into 3 parts, 3 different types of housing here. One third of it is an extra care facility for older people, but the building as a whole houses a huge range of people of all different ages. And what I love is that it's an absolute microcosm of a truly mixed community. So far the examples have been UK ones, but this is a development in Copenhagen. And I guess it's a bit of a Marmite building from the outside, but it's beautifully thought through internally and right and externally. Actually, these jaunty little balconies catch the sun and give people appropriate privacy but shelter as well. It's a very windy area, and inside the flats are arranged in small groupings or sort of household groupings, if you like. The vast majority of the occupants have dementia. That wasn't the intention, but the building works really, really well for them, and each household has its own little kitchen where the occupants are very much involved in the day-to-day cooking and life inside the building. This slide draws out some of the themes that we noticed in our investigations and things that we think will become more common as time goes on. I won't read them out because you can and time is short, but if you just take a minute to skim this list, as I say, here are some of the things that we think are increasingly important and likely to remain so. We've noticed an increase in open plan living, which makes perfect sense for older people, or semi-open plan. This one has a sliding door, you can see from the plan on the left. The photograph on the right isn't the same building actually, but again, somebody's given a great deal of thought to the interior, and it's full of light and a delightful space to be in. Another theme we noticed is that buildings are becoming less institutional. In particular, there's a move away from double bank corridors, which always feel very institutional, to other forms of circulation. This is a very healthy option, an external access gallery that gives access to people's individual homes, and I think is a more convivial solution as well, which is an extra bonus. Technology is already playing a huge role, and that too is set to expand. These slides show how it can help us stay connected, and I think that's very poignant in light of COVID, and digital ways to connect with people that we can't physically see is really, really important. But as you'll all know, robotic carers are already in operation in some countries, and it's definitely a theme for the future. And of course, the next generation of older people will have grown up with the digital age anyway. I mean, this will be normal technology to them, so that'll also make a huge difference. And the last of the themes I'm going to mention this morning are the desire for older people themselves to be more involved in shaping their own futures. And to me, that makes perfect sense. This is a co-design session for the Barnett scheme, the co-living scheme, and it's just lovely. I mean, as an architect, I would love this opportunity to sort of get around the table with some of the people who would eventually end up living in the development I'm designing for them. I think it's complicated. It's taken an awfully long time, and You do have to be patient, but I think it's very much the way things need to go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to move the debate on now to talking about the existing housing stock and why it's so absolutely critical that we make the existing homes that we have out there already good places to age. 80% of the homes that we'll all be living in, those of us who are still around, hopefully, by 2050 are already built. And so for the health of our nation and the health of the occupants of our existing homes, we absolutely have to tackle its poor condition. It's certainly important, as previous speakers have reflected, to make sure that we build new homes better. It's certainly important that we expand the sorts of places people live when they absolutely can't live in ordinary housing any longer. But the really big item that we have to sort out is making our good homes for ageing in the existing stock. It's where most people live. 96% of older people live in ordinary homes. You'll have heard me say that before. And it's where most people want to live. Not everyone, but where most want to live. We've been hampered by a lot of lazy assumptions and ageism. Ageism which says if you get old, you ought to move. And if you live in a home that needs work doing on it, it's somehow your fault. The reality is around 10 million people of all ages in England are living in 4.3 million homes which are not decent. And around half of those, 2 million, are over 55. This is a massive issue because 78% of those 2 million non-decent homes lived in by an older person are owner occupied. So this issue of low-income home ownership, non-decent homes, poor health, and the resulting impacts on the NHS and social care is something we absolutely have to grasp. The main reason homes are non-decent are falls at home and cold. And many of you will recognise those are the main reasons that older people have to call on the health service, non-elective admissions. Main reason, falls risk. If we have a second wave of COVID in the winter, cold homes will potentially exacerbate that situation. So it's critical that we have time, we take the action now to improve that stock. So the impetus for change, as I see it, which we could potentially use, is an interest, a political will, we might hope, to do something about homes which have come so much to the fore. I have to say, on the other side of the coin, transformation requires political will, political vision, and leadership. One, I'll leave you to think about whether that's been present or lacking in recent months. Carbon reduction could be an opportunity to retrofit our homes to make them better places to age. A great deal of conversations about this, quite a lot of fuzzy thinking, but it's something that might press the button with Treasury. We're facing the most extraordinary level of unemployment. Once furlough ends, once some of the collapses go ahead that have been shored up so far, and there's going to be a great deal of interest in job creation. Could this be an opportunity to create jobs in the building industry, particularly with the decline in new build? Maybe. Connected to this is Brexit, of course, and the overall skills shortage of builders, but it's one that I think we have to connect to. And last but not least is the argument around levelling up. This came to the fore, remember those days of an election last December 2019? And the gains in areas which face huge levels of disadvantage, inequality, and I would add poor housing and an ageing population in poor housing. We'd had great hopes that there might be action to level up through retrofit and regeneration of those areas, and perhaps that's something also that we need to keep in mind for the future. Thank you.
Right, you've got Jeremy Porteous back, and first of all, I have to extend apologies that the atmospherics have got my computer this afternoon, and you have me on audio and not visual. But first, can I thank the three speakers for three excellent presentations, really wide-ranging, and I want to pick up on several of those themes that you've raised throughout those presentations, as well as take questions from 100-odd people who've joined us this afternoon. So can I just sort of kick off by saying, you know, as I think you've all hinted at, the last few months have shown, you know, how important our homes are and how through these extraordinary times, the build quality, the environment, the places we live in are really important in terms of the connectedness we make, as well as our health and well-being. David, you talked about sort of the prescriptive model, and I like the sort of the 5 A's that you set out, some of these things around assistance, access, accessibility. And I was wondering whether that links in neatly to some of the things that Julia was saying around co-designing, and whether those values that you think are important in determining the housing quality are both the market that you hinted at, but also around the way we design and work within our communities. So how do we engage more effectively around that?
Yeah, I think Julia might want to come in. I mean, I think there's a lot of, one of the problems I think is that there's an awful lot of good practice and really quite robust understanding of what can work, be it in terms of the development, design and provision of different forms of specialist provision for older people, in some of the sort of innovative solutions that Julia was talking about. I think also in terms of what Sue was talking about, we have a good understanding of what can be done in terms of dealing with issues around the housing quality crisis that we have within our housing stock. The challenge I think we face is sort of scaling that up. I think what's innovative and productive and useful in terms of, you know, co-production, as Julia talked about, in terms of interventions that are positive in terms of adaptations to allow people to live healthy lives independently in homes of their own. The challenge is scaling all of that up within a housing system which isn't really geared to attend to the housing options and priorities of people in older age, which is a point both of the speakers have made. And that inevitably takes us into the realm of politics. I say with politics, not necessarily party politics, but into political discussions around what kind of housing system we actually want and what we think it can contribute to our society. And I think that's where the discussion gets slightly more vexed and challenging and problematic, to find a way through to a future which kind of recognises that housing is really important to individuals' health and well-being and quality of life, but also to the common good of society. And I think those contributions of housing have been lost within some of the political discussion and debate. And the challenge is, how do we sort of rediscover that as researchers, practitioners, providers, and try and stimulate a more positive future? I think that's something we'll probably delve into, but maybe I'll leave space for the other speakers to chip in and contribute.
Well, no, that's really helpful, and maybe something that Sue wants to come on to talk about, because I think the political domain, especially in a week that's seen the Prime Minister talk about funding for infrastructure and the way to regenerate our homes and our communities. I think his term was build, build, build. Well, Sue, I think you may have some concerns about what his emphasis is, but also how we plan for some of this to take into account some of the age-friendly principles, bearing in mind what Lifetime Homes, Lifetime Neighbourhoods set out over 10 years ago too. So Sue, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've got huge concerns about the developments this week around the quality of the housing stock. And we've just seen this reversion back to simplistic political headlines of number of new units that will be built. And this is very unhelpful. And the potential impact and the potential for going backwards around the quality of new homes, if the proposed relaxation around planning goes ahead, I have grave concerns about. It has become build, 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 and it's a very London Southeast housing shortage simplistic narrative to say that we just got to build lots of new homes. If you go to different parts of the country, especially outside London and South East, the issue is not that there are no homes. There are empty homes, there are poor quality homes, there are homes that people can't afford to rent, can't afford to purchase. And so this is far more complex, it's far more interconnected with the economy, incomes, poverty, disadvantage. And I've got another concern I have is what's going to happen to some pretty ropey stock that the building industry can't sell. And what if you learn from history on this one, even if money is thrown at the social rented sector, and it certainly needs it, there will be a temptation to buy some of that surplus stock, which is again of very poor quality, unadaptable. A lot of it has poor thermal standards, as opposed to, you've seen the social rented sector be the absolute pioneer of higher quality build, particularly when it had to do that under the Code for Sustainable Homes. We saw in accessible home standards the great leap forward from 5% of our housing stock being accessible and visitable. It jumped up to 7%, and there it has stuck. And if you mind that, that was largely driven by mandatory Code for Sustainable Home standards, which the social rented sector adhered to. Just to go back to the regeneration of the current housing stock and the shortage of dwellings, and pass that on to Julia after that. I still really worry that this is going to carry on being ignored. It just seems to be very hard to get a political message across when it's all driven by building industry interests. There's very few people been around long enough to recognise those gains and how to do it well. So there's some fuzzy thinking about regeneration, refurbishment, and what that actually means at a locality level. I am hopeful that something might well happen in the Greater Manchester area and the Liverpool City region area, because the two mayors there are interested and they see this very much as connected to job creation that I mentioned already. I would say I did create a slide pack. It will be available afterwards, but then I was radical and just talked to you. And last but not least, I will come back to this perhaps on another question. I think this deep-seated ageism that older people are okay, and if they're not okay and they're homeowners, then it's up to them. And all that, I agree so much with what David said about reframing the concept of what is housing for, and the common good, as opposed to just an asset to acquire, and that a roof over your head is not good enough. We've got a lot of work to do to shift that thinking.
I'll come back to the ageism, because I know the president of the BSG, Tom Sharp, has been very passionate around this, and I think it's something which us in the housing sector need to really embrace much better. So I'll come back to that. But Julia, you referred to the book that you led on for REBA. What others may not know is actually you wrote a very influential book in the same year on space standards as well. And I'm just wondering, some of the debate about relaxing some of the planning, looking at how we generate new growth in our housing on brownfield sites, what is the likely compromise on space? Because it seems to me for older and disabled people in particular, in a week where the Home Coalition are writing to the government to look at accessibility standards, we need to really ramp up, using government term, inclusive design much more, which includes inclusive space.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, accessibility relies on having enough indoor space, doesn't it? It's the two have to go hand in hand. I've been feeling very optimistic that post, COVID would lead to a will to do much better in all sorts of sectors, not least in housing, and that optimism was rather quashed on Tuesday morning, I have to say. I do agree with Sue that the government seems far more fixated on speed than quality, and that's a really and the planning liberalisation that they're talking about is in essence an extension of office to resi conversions, which we've been do on the news and in the press for the last few years. And we've seen eye-wateringly small apartments, haven't we? 13 square metres is not unusual anymore. That's probably the size of, probably a bit smaller than your bedroom, I'm guessing. Certainly around the size of a normal double bedroom, which is only that's the whole home, the bathroom and everything else is in that.
Yeah, sorry.
So just as we're all agreeing that actually we need more space in our homes, and working from home is another, that's here to stay, I think, in some form, and another justification for a bit more space. I fear that we might go in the other direction.
Thanks very much, you three. There are a couple of questions coming through on the chat room, which I'll turn to in a minute. But the other thing that's really hit us in the last month or so, significantly since the death of George Floyd, is Black Lives Matter. And I want to stay on this theme a little bit, because it seems that we've talked about housing quality, health inequalities, and the other thing is around what is it that our Black and minority ethnic families and groups, how can they both better participate, but also do we know what their needs are in local communities in relation to housing? So I was just wondered, does anyone know of any research that's taking place that specifically looks at that? David, yes.
Yeah, well,
either that or you say there are 5 pieces of research.
Yes, it's not a direct answer to your question in terms of an ongoing piece of research, but it's just a reflection on that broader point. In that actually there used to be, I think, a lot of really interesting, important research ongoing around diversity and housing needs and requirements, and questions also about sort of racialized inequalities within housing provision. I did little bits of research way back when. I remember being commissioned by the Housing Corporation, which was spending huge sums of public money, who wanted to know who was benefiting from the houses that were being built through those grant allocations. And those questions were more reflected upon. And the Commission for Racial Equality would ask questions about policy and practices that maybe were driving outcomes in terms of housing opportunities that were not equally distributed within society. And data was collected and analysed around those issues. And at the moment, I think we're in a context where those questions, until the Black Lives Matter movement started raising these issues in the recent weeks and past month, we've not been talking about. There's been no discussion about racialised inequalities in housing outcomes, although if you start exploring the evidence, for example, within the census, there are some research that's around housing issues. You see quite stark, historically ingrained inequalities in terms of housing situations, and picking up on some of Sue's points around sort of the quality of housing on the basis of race and ethnicity. So I think, as much as I can't point to evidence, I think you sort of throw down a gauntlet in terms of why isn't there the evidence, and what should we be doing to understand this issue better? Because compared to where we were, say, 10 or 15 years ago, when there was a wealth of evidence and we understood better what the inequalities were and what we weren't doing right, which is the starting point for trying to put things right. At the moment, I think there's very, very little evidence, hence it's a hidden and denied issue.
Well, thank you. Does anybody else have any comments? I'm aware of some work that the University of Nottingham did with the Centre for Ageing Better last year, and of course Sue and I were on one of the original HopDev member groups with the CLG at that time, and there's some work, but it does seem, as you say, David, it's sort of not been as flourishing of late in terms of doing that research. Look, there's a question in the chat room I want to come to, because it actually draws into another point I wanted to ask you, which is more around intergenerational behaviours, and whether the sort of the political priorities are very much about a focus on younger people's housing priority rather than older people's. Now, I'm not saying that there's ageism there, but it could well be argued that there is an ageist approach there. Now, I was just thinking about whether that's sort of both intergenerational, but also the question is also about, does it come back to the fact that many older people are far less likely to want to move? So the churn in the housing market that we talked about earlier in the presentation isn't as the throughput isn't as great. So any thoughts about the sort of the balance between younger and older people's housing?
Yeah,
yeah.
On that one, yeah. I think the narrative around intergenerational conflict in the housing sector has been incredibly unhelpful. And sorry, can you hear me? Because I've just got a message saying I can't hear you.
I can hear you quite loud and clear. I'm sure.
Yeah, it's fine. Just got a big thing up on the screen. Yes, it's a far more complex situation than age, because people tend to think young people get on a housing ladder, get a roof over your head, and you're okay for the rest of your life. And I think people have got far more in common than they've got dividing them. Absolutely, the housing argument, the housing priorities are driven by crisis. We have a crisis of homelessness, we have a crisis of overcrowding, we have a crisis of affordability and shortage in some places. A government policy to expand private rental, and it is a policy, it's not just an accidental market trend, has disadvantaged young people dreadfully. But if those people age in that sector, we're heading for a dreadful future problems of people not being able to afford their rents as they get older once they lose their jobs, not building up an asset, and we've got a care system built reliant on use of people's assets. And so I think we have to really drag that argument into look across the life course, look at what people have connecting them. Even in the private rented sector, which people tend to think is a young person's problem, you have, for all sorts of historical reasons, got a strong concentration of older private renters in the worst end of the market. And that has huge consequences for our health service and our care service. So it's unhelpful just to say, if you could just get all these old people to move, somehow that would give all the young people adequate housing. We have to show what the data, expand on the data, show what the reality is. And I just think, how can clever people think that if there's nowhere to move to, and you haven't got enough homes in the first place in some places, where are older people supposed to move to, even if they wanted to, that would suddenly magically create more space? It's only, it just, the logic doesn't really follow.
So do you want to come back in there, David, as well?
It's just a quick one. I think there's an interesting dynamic in all of this between, Sue's point about by 2050, 80% of housing currently exists. We believe most of the housing stock we rely on for many, many years. I think it's approaching, Sue might know better than me, something like 1 in 5 houses were built pre-1918, something like that. It's a remarkably high figure anyway. Housing is this kind of artifact that as a society we need to protect and maintain, because we need it to be in decent quality and appropriate for people to live in for many, many years. And so there's a societal reason to look after our housing stock. But of course, on a kind of ongoing basis, it's individually owned. There's a tension there, I think, that as a society we've never quite got our heads around. I would, and that links partly into the intergenerational issue. We're thinking about what's good for our society as a collective. We have to think about that. We're not doing, but also what are the rights of the individual. So, recognizing that older people might have, bedrooms they're not utilising because they're in large homes and the family have flown the nest, but that's their home and they're emotionally rooted in that place. And it's very, very important to them. And it's not easy to leave those kinds of situations. And also the choices to leave those kinds of situations are very, very limited. And recognising that rather than blaming older people for utilising, more housing space than it's deemed to be appropriate, I think is more productive. And I agree that kind of intergenerational conflict is missing the point. Both young people and old people evidence need, and it's recognising those needs can vary, but they both have needs that have been unmet within the current housing system.
We've had a couple of questions in the chat room, one specifically for Julia, or two actually. Do you mind if I just ask you, Julia, a couple of things then? First, actually, something that I know we touched on in the age-friendly guide with REVA, which is around post-occupancy evaluations of buildings, and Sheila Peace from the Open University, and also who's just launched a new journal of ageing in the built environment, a plug for her and Robin Darton there. How would you encourage more of that to take place, and particularly for housing for later life, to doing some of those post-occupancy evaluations?
I think it's incredibly important that we do, and we are working on it as a profession. It's quite complicated actually, and difficult to It has to be resourced, has to be paid for by someone. But it's vital, I think, that we learn from what we do and make changes where we need to. Often in housing for older people, specialised housing for older people, the staff are very in tune with how residents feel about certain aspects of the buildings and what would improve their lives. So there's a good source there, and it can be easier to access those residents too. So that's a good place to start. Can I just make one comment about maybe on relation to the previous question? I've been a housing architect for over 30 years. I've never yet had the privilege of designing a home for a specific household or person. We have to design generically when we work on larger developments. I would love that opportunity, but on the other hand, experts agree that any home we build today needs to last at least 200 years. The LGA said last year that if we carry on building at current rates, every home we build today needs to last 2,000 years. Just imagine the succession of different people that are going to live in any one home, that need to live in any one home if we're going to save the planet for a start. So we can only design generically, but that should make us focus our minds on how we can design better for everyone, given that we don't know who they are. So, it's absolutely no excuse. And today's new housing is tomorrow's old housing, and what we don't want to do is have to be retrofitting that in 20 years' time. It's just bonkers. So I think we've got to be much smarter about flexibility and adaptability, which we're building in from the start because they're too difficult to retrofit. A good easy example is wider doors. Very easy to add 50 mil to your doorways when you're building a home. An absolute nightmare once it's built to try and shave off 2 inches because a wheelchair can't get through. Your carpets don't fit, you have to take the doors out, the frames out, messes up your skirting boards. It just makes no sense at all to skimp on that little, extra cost, if there is an extra cost, at the start. Other things we can do later. So I think we do have to design for all ages and as far as possible, and all cultures. I mean, you mentioned Leicester, and of course you're right. It's there is a particular bias in the community there, but we don't want to pigeonhole people into certain types of homes. I don't think, even if that were possible, it's not desirable. So I do think we have to be as inclusive as we possibly can in all of our thinking, and that's the best way to future-proof.
Yeah, no, and I think, you touch on things which are probably very much grounded in the principles of HAPPY, and thinking about that care readiness, not just in terms of the health and well-being, but also linking into Sue's points around climate and environmental change. Somebody made the point about having to work from home, so we need to think about the readiness and future-proofing of our stock. Look, this is the BSG conference. It's very much grounded by people working in research. I know we've got practitioners with us as well. I think all of you sort of talked about a lack of choices, and one of the questions we had sent in is, we're still not building enough housing suitable for people in later life. How do we use research better to influence the policy and planning makers and those decisions? Any thoughts on that?
Not really. It's a bit of a $64,000 question, isn't it?
Well, I mean, some of this could be around your prescription model, or is it the market-led? I'm trying to get a sort of, is there a third way here?
Well, I think there's, yeah, I think, the presumption that the market will spot demand and step in is proving not to be the case. Is my conclusion. If you look at, thinking about Sue and Julia's presentations, I think there's lots of examples where historically post-Second World War state settlement has retreated dramatically. The market hasn't stepped in. I think in some instances the market stepped in, but with a very variable geography. So if you think about specialist housing for older people and private provision, which has boomed over the last sort of 25 years or so, most of that's been in the southeast. So there's something like 39,500 specialist housing units provided by the private sector for own occupation in the southeast, and something around about, I can't remember the exact figure, it's around about 8,000 in Yorkshire. So it's sometimes the market's stepping in, but sometimes it isn't. Depends. There's a geographical dimension to this as well. I think one of the challenges is to think, how can we sort of venture beyond criticism to reflect on, how might markets work differently? How might we inject a kind of care ethic into some of the market functionings? And I don't think we're anywhere near having the creativity to work in those ways yet. But I also think there's some traditional levers that the national policymakers could be pulling. I think of Julia's example about door frames. You could have a regulatory framework that dealt with that and addressed it. But at the moment we don't, and it can be ignored, because what the big builders are absolutely required to do is maximise profit for shareholders. So if you can avoid putting in those adaptations and go with standard door widths, you do. And so I think there are levers that can be pulled, but currently we're in a situation where we're actually deregulating rather than regulating. And if we have regulation, we haven't got anybody to enforce it because of reduction in environmental health officers or town planners and such like. So I think I'm not really helping, am I?
I think what you're saying is we need to track and trace the quality of our housing. Sue,
just to try to throw down the gauntlet, I suppose, to the research world. I have to say that if you're faced with trying to persuade politicians that what you're proposing is a good thing, the bottom line is, where's the fiscal gain? I mean, just setting aside even for a moment that the whole political politics of making the argument for better housing, I suppose I can see a flaw in it, but what we've had to do around, for example, the arguing for adaptation support, is go to the bottom line. And how does this save the NHS money? If the NHS is top of the tree in terms of what drives decision making, and Treasury says, what's your cost benefit of this intervention in terms of NHS and care? That's where we need the evidence, and that's where we have to put the case. And you can have the most sympathetic minister, and we've been through this with a very sympathetic minister. You've mentioned Happy there, and that minister still needed data to take to Treasury, because even if they wanted to do something, they had to go and argue the case. And so absolutely, whether it's regeneration of existing homes, whether it's building new homes, what we need from the research world is, if you spend X, you will gain Y. And we've had to do this. You might criticise some of the ways that we've had to do it with counterfactuals and so on, but we absolutely need that hard data. The softer stuff is brilliant to have about making lives better, improving well-being, but it comes down to the bottom line.
Right, thanks ever so much for your contributions. I've been asked if I can start winding up and draw this to a close. I want to do so, and it's probably, I'm going to have to say this rather than throwing it out. Sue sort of raised issues around stop ageism and things about how we tackle some of the fundamentals around both our institutional ageism, but also some of the practice we've got in terms of the way we work with and for and with older people and our ageing populations. I do think it means a fundamental rethink. We
do need to have a bit more research on this as well. And I know there are a whole host of ways that the BSG and others can work to address this, whether it's simple things around how older people are pictured and images of older people in the national press, right through to policy statements and the like, and how we talk not about older adults or we will often talk about the elderly. So I think what we're talking about here is that we need to have a housing future for all of us. If we don't do so, the housing poor quality that we've described this afternoon will only lead to greater health inequalities. And these are points that we will take up both in high-level research as well as influencing and informing people through what works on the ground. So on behalf of everybody listening, on behalf of the BSG, can I thank David, Sue and Julia for your real thought-provoking presentations, and do please continue this conversation offline and through the LIN and the BSG. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.